Chapter 2, Gary's Journey. The sound of gravel crunching beneath the tires echoed louder than it should have in the stillness of the evening. Gary shifted his Jeep into park and let out a heavy sigh, resting his hands on the steering wheel for a moment longer than necessary. The driveway of his modest home in Cairo, Michigan stretched out before him, illuminated by the dim golden rays of a setting sun. Shadows crept across the quiet neighborhood where the only other sound was the faint chirping of crickets. It was a picturesque scene, but for Gary, it brought no solace. He grabbed his lunchbox and thermos from the passenger seat of the Jeep and climbed out, his boots hitting the driveway with a dull thud. The familiar exhaustion was back, an ache that had nothing to do with the physical strain of his job or the hour-long commute. It was the emotional weight, the invisible load he carried daily that seemed to press down hardest now. As he trudged toward the front door, Gary's mind wandered. This wasn't the life he had envisioned for himself, not by a long shot. In his youth, Gary had been a star, someone people gravitated toward. High school had been his kingdom, where he reigned as a popular athlete with a quick wit and a confident smile that could light up any room. He loved running track, the exhilarating rush of adrenaline as his feet pounded against the ground, the wind tugging at his hair, and the roar of the crowd as he crossed the finish line. Life had seemed limitless then, full of possibilities. He always had a girl by his side, each one drawn to his effortless charm. But that life, that feeling of being unstoppable was gone now, a distant memory that felt like it belonged to someone else. After high school, Gary had taken a bold step into adulthood by enlisting in the army. Stationed in Germany for 3 years, he had found a sense of discipline and purpose he hadn't known he needed. The structure of military life was a far cry from the carefree days of high school, but it gave him something else, a foundation. He returned to Michigan with a steadiness about him, a readiness to build the life he'd dreamed of. That was when he met Ashley. Ashley had been everything Gary thought he wanted, lively, outgoing, and full of big plans. She made him laugh and reminded him of the person he used to be. Within a couple of years, they were married, and Gary had thrown himself wholeheartedly into building a future with her. The years that followed were a blur of hard work and fleeting moments of joy. Gary worked long hours in various jobs, often juggling multiple roles to make ends meet. His focus was singular, to provide for his growing family. He and Ashley had 3 children, 2 daughters, and a son, who became the center of his world. They were his reason for pushing through the exhaustion and the stress. But behind the smiles and the family photos was a reality far less picturesque. Ashley, once so vibrant and full of life, seemed to grow colder as the years went by. She refused to contribute financially, insisting that managing the household and the children was enough. Gary didn't complain, at least not at first. He told himself it was his duty to provide, that it didn't matter if the burden was uneven as long as his family was taken care of. But as the years stretched on, Ashley's sharp words and dismissive attitude began to cut deeper. There were nights Gary would come home after a grueling day, only to find himself banished from their bedroom by a barrage of insults. He started sleeping in his son's room more often than not, his pride bruised but his resolve unbroken. He kept telling himself things would get better, that if he worked harder, loved her more, she might see how much he was giving, how much he cared. The first betrayal shattered that fragile hope. Gary could still remember the gut-wrenching moment when he discovered Ashley's infidelity. The pain was searing, a betrayal that felt like it had come out of nowhere. Ashley had apologized, her tears convincing him it had been a mistake, a moment of weakness. Desperate to keep his family together, Gary forgave her. He clung to the hope that this could be a turning point, that they could rebuild what was broken. For a time, things seemed better. Ashley was more attentive, more engaged. Gary allowed himself to believe in the possibility of healing. But the cycle repeated, and each new betrayal chipped away at his trust and his sense of self. Still, he stayed. For the kids, he told himself. For the dream of a life he had promised them all. He convinced himself he was doing the right thing, even as the weight of Ashley's actions bore down on him. The breaking point came on a day Gary would never forget. It was a simple decision to come home early, to surprise Ashley and maybe recapture some of the warmth that had been missing for so long. Instead, he found her with another man, in their home. The sight burned into his memory, a cruel and final confirmation that there was no fixing this. The divorce that followed was both a relief and a wound that wouldn't heal. Gary moved out of the family home, leaving behind not just a house, but the life he had poured everything into. Ashley wasted no time moving her boyfriend in, an act that felt like twisting the knife already lodged in Gary's heart. The guilt of leaving his children behind mingled with the bitterness of betrayal, leaving Gary questioning everything he thought he knew about love, loyalty, and the life he had worked so hard to build. As he opened the door to his new home and stepped inside, the emptiness of the space hit him. It was quiet, too quiet, but it was his. For the first time in years, Gary could begin to reclaim himself, piece by piece. But where would he even start? For years after the divorce, Gary's life became a study in solitude. His days followed a routine that left little room for reflection or distraction. Every morning he rose before the sun, packed his lunch, and climbed into his Jeep for the hour-long commute to the factory where he worked. Each evening he returned home to a quiet house that echoed with the absence of laughter and life. His focus wasn't on himself, but on his children, his youngest son especially. Gary had fought to give his son the stability he'd been robbed of during the turmoil of the divorce. He stayed in Cairo, despite the long drive to work, so his son wouldn't have to uproot his life. It wasn't easy, but for Gary, it was worth it. Sacrificing comfort and convenience was a small price to pay if it meant his son could finish high school with the friends and routine he had always known. When it was his time with the kids, Gary did his best to make every moment count. He took his son fishing at the nearby lake, even though he often felt too tired to enjoy it. He cooked their favorite meals, even if he only managed to eat a few bites himself. He tried to be present, to show them that they still had a father who cared. But even in these moments, there was an underlying sadness, a quiet reminder of the family he had once worked so hard to keep together. Gary's own emotions were a storm he tried to ignore. He carried the weight of the divorce like a heavy backpack he couldn't set down, no matter how much he wanted to. He blamed himself, even though he knew the fault didn't rest solely on his shoulders. His failures felt magnified in the quiet moments, those nights when he stared at the ceiling and replayed the choices he had made. If he had been more attentive, more patient, or just better, maybe things could have turned out differently. But he had long since stopped hoping for reconciliation or even companionship. The last 12 years had hardened him in ways he hadn't fully realized. Love, once a source of joy and hope, had become a concept he dismissed entirely. Relationships were messy, painful, and ultimately not worth the risk. He had learned that lesson too well. Gary had built emotional walls so high that nothing and no one could penetrate them. His heart was closed, locked away behind layers of distrust and self-preservation. Vulnerability was a weakness, and weakness was something he couldn't afford. He had been burned too many times, first by Ashley and later by his own expectations of what life should be. The idea of dating was almost laughable. Who had the time? More importantly, who had the energy? It wasn't just about finding someone new. It was about finding someone who wouldn't bring more pain, more disappointment. He doubted such a person even existed. His standards, shaped by years of heartbreak and reflection, were impossibly high. Besides, what could he offer anyone? A guarded man with scars too deep to hide and a heart too damaged to share? Yet, for all his convincing arguments about why he was better off alone, Gary couldn't entirely shake the feeling that something was missing. It wasn't the kind of loneliness that gnawed at him, nor the kind that drove him to seek company. It was quieter than that, a sense of disconnection, like a dull ache that never fully went away. His life had become an existence rather than a journey. He worked, he parented, and he existed. But dreaming? Hoping? Living? Those things felt distant, like relics of a life he'd once known but could no longer claim. In his rare moments of introspection, Gary acknowledged that he'd stopped hoping long ago. Dreams had died with his marriage, and love was for fools. People who let their guard down got hurt. That was a truth he believed more deeply than anything else. The fortress he had built around himself was sturdy, unyielding, and necessary. It kept the pain out, but it also kept the world at arm's length. And that was fine with him. At least that's what he told himself. But life has a way of challenging even the most fortified defenses, and Gary's were no exception. Somewhere, without him realizing it, the faintest crack had begun to form. It wasn't obvious, nothing so dramatic as a lightning bolt or a grand revelation. It was subtle, quiet, like the first thaw after a long winter. He didn't know it yet, but someone was on the horizon, someone who would challenge everything he thought he knew about love and trust. Samantha. Her arrival in his life wouldn't be sudden or explosive. There wouldn't be a moment where the walls came crashing down. It would be a gradual process, a slow unraveling of the armor he had spent years perfecting. But for now, Gary couldn't see any of that. He wasn't looking for a spark or even a flicker of connection. Gary was content with his walls, his fortress, his solitary life, or at least he had convinced himself he was. And for the time being, that was all that mattered, or so he thought.